Welcome everybody. Today I'm really thrilled that the Good Food Hub is hosting the kind of post COP27 briefing for food entrepreneurs. There was obviously a huge global climate summit just a month ago, almost to the day, and lots of big announcemements and exciting news that's kind of making some progress on climate change, but also some people have also felt that we didn't go far enough, as always, given the kind of existential significance of climate change. But we wanted to make sure we had a call today that was really about saying, what does this mean for food entrepreneurs? There's a lot of kind of high-level policy talk and science and big direction setting, but if you're running a small business, you've got a big role to play in the food system. You are small food businesses manage about half the food in the planet, and the food system is responsible for about 1/3 of all emissions, and more than that, the food system can be a huge contributor to actually sequestering carbon, so we can move in the other direction if we get it right. So the food entrepreneurs are going to be at the front edge of driving change. What came out of COP27 that's of importance? So we are kind of exploring that through 3 different questions. One is, what are the long-term trends we're seeing that might inform the business strategy of food entrepreneurs? Secondly, were there any new initiatives that might unlock opportunities and be significant to food SMEs? And then as we look ahead, how can we do a better job of advocacy on behalf of food SMEs playing their role in tackling climate change? We'll then open up to questions from everybody else and anybody joining in. I also just need to thank EIT Food, who are still our sponsors through EU funding. But then I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers for the day. We've got Marilique Nijmeijer, who is joining us from Climate, who are real wonderful expert body that sits at that intersection between food and climate, and they ran the Food Systems Pavilion, so lots of great events there. You're right in the thick of things. We've also got Fiona Napier, who's part of the UN, the Climate Champions team, and the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience initiatives, and you're their lead, I think, for nature-based solutions or nature aspects, which includes all the agricultural work, and you've got a strong leaning to sort of making that meaningful in Africa, based out of Nairobi. So thank you for joining Fiona. And then lastly, Julia Weatherhogg, who works for the UNFCCC and heads up, coordinates the Climate Food Systems Resilience Alliance, of which Good Food Hub is a member and brings in SMEs perspective. So again, you were there in the middle of all sorts of initiatives, and really grateful to have all 3 of you here, having been in the room in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we're going to kick off with the first question and set of reflections. And I'm going to look to Julia to kick us off here. Julia, if you were a small, you put yourself in the perspective of being a small business out in the world somewhere. Our members are everywhere from India to Ghana to Colombia, and you've got your head down, you're running your, I don't know, your business that's trying to bring solar powered irrigation systems, or you're trying to run a kind of composting service in Kenya, or you're producing baked goods using regenerative agriculture in Brazil. But you're looking up, you're hearing these conversations, you care about the issue, you want your business to be part of the solution. But what is it that happened that might steer the future of your business? What are some of the trends that you saw about during COP27 that should inform the way I'm making decisions about my strategy and my daily operations as a business? Yeah, really curious to hear some reflections from you on that.
Thank you so much, Ian, and thanks for having me, and welcome to all of you joining this call. I would like to help my intervention with 1 slide that my colleague Victoria will kindly put up for me. So Ian, if you could just confirm when you can see the slide, that would be great.
Got it.
Wonderful, it's up. So I heard you say, Ian, before that, food systems account for more than 1/3 of total greenhouse gas emissions. And I was just doing my research ahead of this meeting on the portion that the SMEs are responsible for, and it's 60 to 70% of all food emissions can be tracked down to SMEs and smallholder farmers as well. And I think that's very interesting because it shows the huge amount of potential that this group of stakeholders has in terms of revolutionizing climate and food systems. So unfortunately, I feel like sometimes the SMEs fall into a middle ground, and maybe this was the feeling that some of you had at COP, as it's always so difficult and expensive and intensive to participate there and have your voice heard. But I think Ian did a wonderful job in trying to bring some voices at COP27, and hopefully we'll have an even better result at COP28. So in terms of what we can share in terms of the influence for the longer term, which might impact small and medium enterprise. We can see that with regards to tracking emissions and reporting, there is a trend towards simplification. So there are two big examples of this trend. One is that the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, actually launched its net zero guidelines to bring a common reference for collective efforts to reach net zero. And you will say this is nothing new, but actually there were a lot of different frameworks and guidelines towards, the reporting towards the net zero. And we can see this is actually an effort towards simplification. And similarly on reporting, the EU officially adopted the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which actually makes it easier for SMEs to report information to banks, clients, and investors on their efforts towards sustainability, and definitely helps them play a role in the transition to a sustainable economy as well. I was with Marilique in the Climate Pavilion and other food pavilions as well. This year had the highest number of food pavilions compared to the previous years. I think there were 3 or even more. And I could tell that a lot of the discussions in the pavilions actually focused on behavioral changes and how consumer choices definitely can make a big difference. And I know that from the conversations we've had with this group, a lot of small and medium enterprises are really driven by their consumer demands, and we can see that more and more policymakers, governments are paying attention to this trend as well, and I think it's going to be incremental towards COP28 as well. There was one initiative that I would just like to touch upon with this regard. It's the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition. It's ICAN, and basically focuses on the potential to accelerate green ambitions and attract customers that can make a difference in their everyday choices, especially with regards to nutrition in Africa. And I know that we have a question focused on the different initiatives, so I think maybe Marilique and Fiona might expand on this as well. But just to say that the behavioral and the consumer aspect was quite prominent and set to increase in this sense as well. I think COP27, with the launch of the FAST initiative, so the Food and Agriculture for a Sustainable Transformative Initiative, actually highlighted the need to increase both public and private investments to scale up current solutions. Because Ian, as you know, food systems receive just 3% of public climate finance annually, and small-scale farmers actually only receive 1.7% of climate finance flows. So the FAST initiative is really gearing up towards increasing and repurposing that finance available to food systems, and in particular, I think nations will be asked to collect and share information on the current levels of climate finance for farmers and investments in the sustainable food systems as well. And lastly, I think for me, it was really interesting to see all the conversations around the renewables, and you could really tell that hydrogen was quite heavily promoted at COP27 as an opportunity for a reliable and renewable energy. And I think the Hydrogen Transition Summit advocated hydrogen as one of the most promising options for the creation of a low carbon transport infrastructure. Before I close my short wrap up, I think there were two publications which might be of interest to this group. In particular, we singled out the FAO's new publication on the role of bioeconomy in driving climate action, which could be of relevance for food entrepreneurs because it's a way to keep businesses on track to achieve climate goals and accelerate the pace towards the green transition. And the other relevant report launched at COP was Sustainable Food Cold Chains, which was launched by the Cool Coalition, and basically advocates for sustainable food chains that can lower food waste, but also make agricultural systems more efficient and have a lower impact on climate change, of course. So with that, Ian, I've rounded up what for me were the main indications of longer trends, which were highlighted at COP27. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. And, you know, as a thinking about being a food entrepreneur, there's some things in there that I hear. One is actually expecting consumer demand to increase, and some of the pressures and the behavior choices for perhaps lower carbon, sort of more climate friendly food systems, and actually almost being able to think about how I market myself in that terms and have integrity behind it. Secondly, I heard about standards coming through, and generally those add cost and a burden to a lot of food SMEs and can actually lock smaller companies out of value chains because they don't have the resources to participate. But the simplification is something that has been asked for and wants to see of different standards. So, you know, in a way, that's a positive trend and means that perhaps that's more attainable. I'm curious, but perhaps whether Marilique or Fiona, I did also hear a lot about growing expectation from corporates to have more integrity on the reporting. I wonder whether that will get pushed down value chains to smaller companies as they go down and look at their scope 3 emissions, which are the ones that they inherit from their supply chains. Yeah, and then in a way, the cold chains one just highlights this sense that the more the businesses are making our supply chains more efficient and our food system more efficient, there's opportunities there as well, and those demands will come through the market in some ways. Curious whether as well the kind of, will we see increased funding into this space coming from public and private money, and whether that's private investors that are looking for impact investments or public monies coming through. There should again be a kind of an encouragement, although it may be a slow burn in terms of the value, but an encouragement to entrepreneurs working in this space. Fiona or Marilique, anything, you know, listening to that you would build on in terms of the kind of long-term trends that you witnessed that perhaps might be of import to businesses?
Yes, thanks, Ian. Very good to be on this call, especially one that's hosted by Rossa Fiery, my former alma mater. I would say, yeah, especially on supply chains, actually, there's also considerable discussion amongst many businesses, not least those who are in insurance and kind of trade lines around more supply chain transparency using technology available. So I think we'll see two trends. One, unfortunately, because like you, I have some insights into, you know, the world of food SMEs. I think there is going to be more demands made on SMEs, particularly those who supply international, but also regional markets, for being clear about where the food's sourced from, what practices we used in making the food products, for example. But I think also in the world of financing and agri-financing, there's going to be a push for more supply chain transparency. So that's one to watch. I don't know if Marilique has anything to add.
Marilique?
Yeah, I think actually very much in line with what Gillian and Fiona are saying. I think also what we saw is, this is touching on the next question as well, but one of the initiatives that was not launched at COP27, but that was being discussed, was the G7 Sustainable Supply Chains Initiative. So this was actually launched in the UK, but they did have another event at COP27 talking about how they are now moving from commitment to action. So I think, again, that really shows that there is this shift towards indeed more transparency and more sustainability, therefore, in supply chains. And the World Benchmarking Alliance is collaborating with them also and is creating standards that are also tracking sustainability in food and agriculture supply chains, but also in other supply chains. So I think that that's definitely a trend that we'll see. And I'm no expert on food SMEs, but one example maybe. At the Food Systems Pavilion, we served coffee from a very small business called Wild Coffee. They're based in Uganda, and why we chose them is actually because they have a fully traceable supply chain, and it's all locally sourced coffee and also very good. But so there is no middleman, and all the income actually goes to the producers. So I think, I'm not sure if this is the case, but I can see that while it maybe offers challenges, it can also maybe offer opportunities for the more local and therefore smaller businesses. So maybe there's two sides to the coin.
I mean, it does make so there is a lot of our SMEs are increasingly focused on almost direct farm to consumer linkages and shortening and simplifying that supply chain a lot. And actually, once you simplify it, that a lot of that transparency just is inherent because it's a direct relationship. And with technology, there's more and more of those kind of link ups, particularly in local markets, that some of the businesses here are kind of managing that process. So it's kind of interesting, affirming trend perhaps for some of those folks. Well, Marilique, actually, you are going to take the lead on the next question. So it builds on this very nicely, which is, I mean, I sort of every day during COP27, I was getting another long set, various emails listing initiatives coming at me. It was like a machine gun of new initiatives. And both that's clearly exciting because there's lots of work to be done, but I really struggled to make sense of going, which of these are meaningful, which ones are meaningful to the people that I work with, the food SMEs, which ones are great, but they're so up in the air and long term that it doesn't affect us right now. So I'm really curious whether you were kind of keeping track of some of those, and you were there. Were there any that jump out and you're going, actually, this one's, if I was a food entrepreneur, I'd want to know about this one. Which ones would you flag for us?
I fully agree with you that at some point it was just a web of initiatives and commitments coming out and difficult to keep track. Actually, Julia and her colleagues, they made a very useful overview of some of these initiatives. So that also for me was definitely helpful. And based on that and some other commitments and statements made at COP27, a colleague of mine did a very quick scan and actually noticed that around $25 billion have been committed for climate action in agriculture and food systems. So I think maybe this is linking back to the trend that we're seeing, but at least it shows that there is a increased interest in really tackling climate action in food systems. And I think that in general is also for food SMEs definitely a positive trend. And I think that also links to sort of what do these broader commitments and initiatives mean on a smaller level. I think not all of, or I know not all of them will make it based on past COPs and past initiatives. I think we all know that they're not all going to make it, but I do think that again they show this trend, and that it's also how can you use maybe those higher level commitments for your own benefit. And so I think the fact that there is a big sum of money being committed, and also I think what we had at the Food Systems Pavilion, but definitely also the other pavilions dealing with food, is really this inclusive conversation where already businesses were definitely part of the conversation. And I think that sort of shift that we're all in this together and that we need action on all levels is definitely useful. But then maybe diving into some initiatives a bit more in depth. So Julia already mentioned the ICANN nutrition, the ICANN initiative on nutrition. So the Initiative for Climate Action on Nutrition is what it stands for. This was one of the presidency's initiatives, and one other one that they launched that Julia mentioned as well was the Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation initiative, so the FAST initiative. And also these initiatives, of course, we have to see now moving forward where they'll go and where they'll be taken, but they are both multi-stakeholder in nature as well. So they've been developed also in taking into account private sector perspectives as well as public sector, and they're also really encouraging all different kinds of stakeholders to be engaged in these initiatives also going forward, and also shaping sort of what is needed, and focusing on how can small actors sort of contribute to making this a reality. So I think that that's definitely one to keep an eye, or two to keep an eye out for. Then there was an African Food Systems Transformation Initiative, and I think this is specifically focusing actually on agribusinesses in Africa. So depending on where you're based, but I think that's also really looking into how can businesses contribute to this transformation, and also I think just some of the discussions that we've had specifically at the pavilion. So I mentioned already the Sustainable Supply Chains Initiative, but also there was a lot of alternative protein, and I think it's definitely an example of how private sector can develop technology, but also really contributing to that shift that we need to see. And I think the partners that we had, so we had the Good Food Institute, but then they partnered with others as well, working on this. But it really shows that you can also use the sort of global level as an opportunity to showcase what you're doing on a more local level. And I understand that, of course, they're not small, but they started out small, and I think that also that shows that there is it works both ways, and there's definitely an opportunity there. And recently I attended the Agri-Logistics Forum at Food Africa in Cairo, where I'm based. And here they looked into specifically one initiative, which is the 123 Pledge initiative on reducing food loss and waste in supply chains. And it's an initiative that's supported by the World Resources Institute and FAO, amongst others, but it's also looking at how small businesses can contribute to this shift. And at the Agri-Logistics Forum, they spoke specifically about cold chain technology, so in line with what Julia was saying before, but also how you can use sort of those commitments made on an international level and use that shift to then respond to challenges and opportunities that arise. So I think maybe we can also see the broader direction that these initiatives are going in as encouragement, but also opportunity for all actors, including SMEs on food.
Thank you, Marilique. I mean, I can feel myself reacting to is one is, wow, it's brilliant to hear this progress and the new initiatives coming out that could have significance for food SMEs. But at the same time, they do still all sound quite distant, and actually in terms of being a kind of concrete steer or benefit to a food SME that's trying to do something in this space. What they need is a policy to change that would open up that they can get their new tech out faster, or they need, kind of cheaper debt because they're delivering ecosystem services, or they need access to carbon credit markets that they don't have access to because they're just for larger investments. They all still feels quite up in the air and not tangible as I know a lot of our entrepreneurs would be hungry for. And I wondered, Julia, Fiona, looks like I've lost Fiona, but anyway, Julia, I don't know whether you had anything you'd build on in terms of an initiative where you were there and were like, oh, if I was a food entrepreneur, this actually would be of material importance to me. I'd be interested in this.
Thanks, Ian. Well, I think that Marilique actually covered them quite nicely. The one that I mentioned of interest was the fast one on increasing the percentage of climate finance to food systems, and hence like the smallholder requirements and reporting as well. Not really an initiative, but rather a conversation that I witnessed at the Resilience Frontiers lab this year was on artificial intelligence, and how NASA Harvest and other companies that are working on AI are actually trying to, bring policymakers to understand that these technologies need to be accessible not only to, the big multinationals, but also the smaller and medium enterprises as well. And I think there were like some very concrete examples in terms of satellite imagery and how you could, better prepare for crop invasions and pests, etc. But there was no concrete initiative linked to this. So it was more of a conversation and again, possibly a trend that we will witness in the coming months and years. So, but thanks, Marilique, for your intervention. I think it was very well carried out.
It did look like there was a US initiative called Aim for Climate that's getting quite a lot of attention. And I know they had some grand challenges, and one of those, the kind of first one that they're pushing forwards that seems like it's getting some profile, is about AI and kind of trying to help businesses do that. So I looked at the website for it. I did find it slightly impenetrable exactly how you applied and what they were both offering and wanting from you, but that seemed perhaps something that's slightly more concrete.
Yes, and I think Aim for Climate also, I saw that they increased their budget for climate smart technologies in food systems by quite a lot, and they also had these sprints, these innovation sprints, they call them. Ian, you might recall we had a conversation with the Aim for Climate representative within the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance a week ago. So I think that group is really shaping up to advance technology implementation for food and climate.
Fiona, I think you dropped off on the internet, but anything you would add in terms of initiatives that you saw that you thought, we should flag for SMEs and entrepreneurs that might be of significance?
Yes, thanks. Apologies, my internet dropped. There's been, for those of us in Nairobi, there's been a heavy rain, but I'm back online now. I guess AFSTI, the Africa Food Systems Transformation Initiative, has already been mentioned. But if we look across COP and look at some of the big themes that were coming out, I would highlight the following. I think looking forward, there's going to be a big focus on a clear roadmap for food systems in general. So that will be driven by countries, but by also high ambition coalitions such as Food Action Now and several others. And I think the challenge and opportunity for SMEs in the food system is to form coalitions such as those around Good Food Hub and insert yourselves in some of these agendas to make sure that the voice of SMEs and agri-food businesses are heard. Because otherwise we risk having some of these discussions dominated by many very informed people, but not from the business side. So I think it's really important to keep abreast of some of those discussions. I would highlight some of the following initiatives under that. The clear roadmap for food systems as being Food Action Now, the Africa Food Systems Transformation Initiative, which is looking to set up in some countries, but also at the country level, there may be government consultations with stakeholders around the shape of food systems, in future. I can think this might be happening in countries such as Kenya and elsewhere, where governments are interested to engage in this system, because we know that COP28 will have a strong feature on food. I think some of the other themes I would highlight will be, just to reiterate, labelling and standards is going to reappear as more important again. Net zero ISO standards were mentioned by Julia, but I think there's also going to be in some markets more of an interest driven by consumers, but later driven by regulations and so on, around regenerative agriculture labels around how food was produced, for example. I think we've already mentioned supply chain transparency. I think also one of the biggest, one of the initiatives at COP27 that was launched that got the biggest coverage was the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. So this is an initiative convened by donors, governments, and others to shape Africa's engagement with carbon markets. I'm speaking to one particular region in the world, but I think the possibilities for carbon and agriculture are significant. And finally, I would highlight food. So consumers, sorry, not food. I would highlight, again, as others have done, consumer interest in some markets. I think we're going to see very innovative campaigns building to encourage consumer interest, which initially in some markets, the very large brands will react to, as they always have done. But I think we will see this filtering down, as we've already spoken, to supply chains. And I think it's interesting, I can see some SMEs from Nairobi on this line. I think it's interesting to focus on city consumers. So there's quite a number of initiatives setting up, focusing on city consumers or cities and food systems. And of course, within urban elites, there is and always has been a strong focus, a growing focus on health, on diet. And so some SMEs are choosing to focus on kind of meeting that consumer demand and being at the front end of that change. To what extent that will have an impact on price and profitability really remains to be seen. And that's where carbon markets can play a role. Because if we see food production and agricultural systems engaging with carbon markets in a useful way, so rewarding, for example, food production side for carbon it's sequestering, then we might see the possibilities for accelerating regenerative agriculture practices and so on. That's rather a general summary, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. And yeah, I can see in sort of answered the last question a bit, is looking ahead to COP28. There's some channels there about how we might be kind of participating advocacy and turning up in some of those spaces. Is there anything else there that you would add in about looking to COP28? It feels like this COP, food was finally like beginning to claim its place at the table. SMEs, I got the sense there was a sprinkling of them there, but really pretty low presence. Any other thoughts on how we make sure, if we're going to COP28, if we are serious about food systems, then it's ridiculous that SME voices aren't more present. How do we turn up and get heard?
I think you want to start getting heard before COP, because the emphasis is on always, as Julia will certainly tell you, on pre-positioning in the lead up to COP. I mean, there's a certain element of a sort of trade fair about COPs now. So just having profile there as a business probably doesn't do any harm. Although I think for SMEs, there's obviously utility in forming coalitions, in forming business associations where your voice and what you're promoting, whether it's insect foods, whether it's certain ways of doing regenerative agriculture, whether it's engagement with carbon markets and as accelerator, whether it's regional groupings and so on, is useful. Definitely useful, because you're going to magnify your voice. But I think most of all, I think it's very, very important that SMEs develop 2 or 3 messages that they want the international community to hear, which speaks to the significance that they hold in the market in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and climate outcomes, as well as just feeding consumers, the interaction that they have with all of us and our diets. It's not just the very large multinationals, it's the much smaller SMEs who interact with most consumers, certainly in the developing world. So being very clear and evaluating that and coming out with this is the market we engage with, guys, right? And this is the market share that we've got as a big coalition. And here are 2 or 3 of the big asks that we have of the international community. If you want, if you would like us to help turn the food system round to more climate smart, climate resilient outcomes, with, of course, good impacts on nutrition. I hope that can be possible. It's not easy. It's not easy. And SMEs are very individual entrepreneurs, but incredibly creative, courageous thinkers who get things done in difficult business environments, and they need to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly am doing this work because I believe in it, and so I think that, for me, the big message I would love to say is, make that case. Food SMEs are the bulk of the food system. They have a huge role to play in, food systems transformation. So you have to have them in the room. But then probably if there was, I've been thinking, what is the clear, compelling ask that would be a strong message that perhaps we'd get other people backing? And I do wonder whether it's to say, look, the sector, 3% of public finance going into climate work is focused on food. It needs to be at least a third. That's, that is such a clear ask that a lot of people get behind. I wonder whether that is the strong advocacy message. Julia and go on, Fiona, you were going to say something in response.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that, and I was going to say that we need to see much more investor courage in backing food SMEs and food entrepreneurs. So obviously, I'm absolutely preaching to the converted, and many more informed investor and entrepreneurs who are part of listening to this webcast. But the importance of actually challenging investors to put their money quite literally where their mouth is.
Maybe that's the headline. Put your money where your mouth is.
Yes.
Yes. Julia and Marilique, anything you build on that if we just look ahead to this kind of SME advocacy role around food, looking ahead to COP28?
I really like Fiona's pitch for a strategy for COP28. I think developing 2 or 3 concrete asks is like the building block. And then, as Fiona correctly said, you would have to start working that well in advance with your parties, with your ministers, with your other reps. And of course, you can find avenues such as the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance, which is happy to support, but also others, other coalitions that have this SME kind of angle and perspective. Make sure that your advocacy efforts resonate with them as well, and that you can, maximize the messaging and the visibility as well. So I think you definitely have a strong case, and the stats are already there, Ian. It's just about shaping the ask and then branding it in a very compelling way, and then strategizing what that would look like. So would it be like a one-liner in the outcome document for COP28? Would it be holding XYZ events at COP28, or having these smallholder farmers and then SMEs fully represented in different pavilions or fora? So I think that's the kind of brainstorming that one would need. So yeah, that's my 2 cents basically.
Thank you. Marilique, any builds?
Maybe 2 things. One, just a practical one. I know that the UAE will be focusing within food specifically on food waste and on innovation. So that might be good to keep in mind. And then I fully agree with what Fiona and Julia said, and maybe linking to the finding alliances, there will also be next year some sort of a food systems pavilion, a food systems hub, or something along these lines. And we're working on also collaborating with the other food pavilions on that. It's not clear who will be a part of it, but I think maybe at COP28 that might also be an avenue to show what you do, and also to build that stronger alliance with other stakeholders. So that's perhaps also something to keep in mind also in the preparations towards 28.
Thank you. As we've got about 15 minutes left, I want to open it up, see if there's other folks here that have got any questions or thoughts. Could be, you know, you're reflecting what's going on, or you've got a question you're curious to hear more about. And I'm particularly looking at Sachin, Thomas, and Natalia, whether any of you've got anything you want to add in or build here. Each of you are closer to entrepreneurs.
I can just add a couple of comments. You know, I think this is really insightful. What we are also seeing is a lot of regionalization in food systems. You know, and the way the you know, all the different events, you know, whether it's, you know, war or food security that countries are you know, prioritizing, we are going to see a more maybe a multipolar sort of world with more regional you know, food supply chains. And what that would mean is that we will need to bring in more efficiency and more effectiveness in these regional supply chains as well. So I would kind of add that one. And second is, you know, I did hear about, you know, food wastage, which obviously makes up almost 1/3 of the entire food system. So there has to be focus on not only food, you know, sort of yield improvements, but also if you know, we really focus on reducing the food wastage along the chain, that would yield you know, quite a bit of gains for the for all the stakeholders as well.
Thank you so much, Sachin. Great points. Natalia, and
Yes,
tell us a little
maybe
bit about
adding to
Mush
that.
Labs.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't follow the chat completely, so I saw it. So
no.
maybe just because it's a very good connection to what Sachin just said. Like Mush Labs is producing novel food by upcycling waste streams of the food industry, putting it in fermenters and growing edible mushroom mycelium on it to produce new food products, which is super climate friendly and is solving the food waste problem. Even though, and now comes to me what I'm asking for a bit, I think that there was far too less about food, as I think many agree. And even we know what the challenges are on one hand, and it's searched for solution like ours and many other startups have, right? That produce novel food with less water, less land, less emissions, which fermentation all fulfills. We have to wait for 18 months for EU novel food regulation, which is against all the pushes of COP and all other conferences. And then on the other hand, we're not allowed to sell it, even though we have this beautiful technology. And not only we, all the entrepreneurs out there. And for me, this is a huge problem. And not only that in Europe you have to wait so long, also that the dossiers between the US, Asia, and Europe are completely different. And there are different things asked. How can a company that doesn't make revenue with so less people write all these dossiers and then wait for it? We heavily depend then on investors. And I think this is not the solution. When you have the technologies and young entrepreneurs who can push it, then pave the way.
That is great. I've heard that multiple times, and that's a sort of tangible, it's very tangible as a sort of thing to take to a COP28 that is, I think otherwise some people in the COP world are blind to the frustration of a sense of like, we've got innovation, we've got solutions, but policy is blocking us getting them into markets at a pace that's needed. And that's also hitting the bottom line for your business as you wade through that red tape and do it in multiple jurisdictions. So that's the kind of, feels like the kind of practical ask that I think if you had SMEs in the room, you'd open people up some blind spots about relatively simple ways of unlocking progress. Thomas, I don't know you. No, Thomas, I don't know whether you're actually there, but or just listening in.
I'm here. I'm just listening in.
I know we've met before. I feel like I recognize your face, but I can't remember where. Maybe tell us a little about who you are and any initial kind of thoughts and reactions to what's being said here.
Yeah. We met in Nashville, actually.
That's right. Yeah. Now I've got it. I had a cup of tea with you. I actually met a real human. That was amazing. Okay.
Yeah. So really phenomenal presentation. It was very interesting for me. I was not unfortunately able to make it to COP, so was listening to things kind of on the periphery and hearing summaries after the fact. But I had initially started a solar powered cold storage company for horticulture in Kenya in 2017. I think we were a bit ahead of the curve from an innovation standpoint, but some really good learnings along the way. And I think a lot of the things that we were running up against in 2017 and 2018 are unfortunately still present in a lot of the ecosystem today. I mean, there's a lot of places where it would be great to get access to that funding, great to get more transboundary kind of institutions that are talking about this. And so really just thrilled to have this opportunity to connect today, because I know many of you are much more connected in these days than I am, but I think the initiatives you all are pushing are important to keep moving forward. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Super. Thanks, Thomas. Well, I mean, something that's in my mind as I listen to this that is how important it is that we get food SMEs in the room. You know, if anything, I feel like part of my job as being chief cat herder amongst the good food entrepreneur community. One of my struggles is, you know, the cats won't pay to be herded. So if we want to begin to get organized to kind of turn up and bring those voices in, we need to make it worth people's while. And that's a big puzzle for me, is how we do that. But you know, your organizations, you're in the middle of holding some of those spaces. So if you see opportunities to figure out how we bring SMEs and get that, you know, the kind of organizing of that supported, that would be great. Federico, you just popped in. Maybe this is my moment to lure you in. Federico is a very old friend that very much has got us into this space, working at another part of colleague of Fiona at the Climate Champions team, lots of the lead on the work on agriculture. You were at COP27 too. But if you've heard the conversation so far, any reflections on what you've been hearing over the last 50 minutes or so?
No, it was very complete. Thank you. Actually, I'm lead on food systems, not just agriculture. And I think it's interesting to say that, because I think one of the things that is just starting to emerge is a food systems vision, which is relatively new. I think still not completely understood. You might, despite the very good work of people, some of them present in this room as well, and you have the pavilions and all of that. But when you look at, is it actually reflected in COP, in decisions, etc., I think there's still some way to go, for sure. And that's, you know, reflected in the fact that there are, you know, if you look at how food systems are represented in NDCs, for example, which is the output of a COP, still very poorly reflected. There is a paper on that by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And of course, and that gets reflected in not a lot of finance for that, et cetera, a lot of the things that have been said here. I think I might just mention some of the things that did get delivered that might be interesting to look at in terms of outputs of COP. So the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, that is a massive collective work by non-state actors that looks across the adaptation spectrum. It includes targets, and those targets do include what would describe a food systems. So not just looking at agriculture, but also looking at food loss and waste, as has been mentioned, and also dietary shift that I don't think a lot of us have mentioned here, but that is a huge, huge part. And you can see some very concrete targets in that plan that the global community should aim for. Those are mirrored in the 2030 breakthroughs that are produced by the climate champions in a very wide consultation process, including also, for example, Climate, which helped us host some of the workshops, and a lot of partners that you would recognize. And I think that for the first time, you start to see what would be some global targets that actually describe food systems that we can all globally aim for, right? And that is all based on the work of particular organizations that might work in just one part of the food systems, like alternative protein, for example, or agriculture, indeed. So those were two concrete outputs. In terms of material outputs, like investment, money, etc., I really do think Aim4C deserves to stand out. They double down on their investment. It actually, if you look at what their actual innovation sprints are, the 30 that they have going, I think a lot of those can be applicable to, there's room for SMEs there in innovation spaces, maybe highly technological SMEs. I'm not saying anything about whether it's fair, whether it's fairly distributed between the global south and the north, but there is room for investment. There is a lot of innovation in there, and it's not just AI. And I think that with the next COP in UAE, and UAE being in the lead, or co-lead of Aim4C, you can expect that to grow as well. So it's something to look out for. Something that didn't get a lot of attention right before COP, the Norwegians launched their food security strategy. That actually, it's worth having a look at that because it actually deliberately focuses SMEs and small producers. And the Norwegians have been good funders of this. They prioritize African countries. I think Ghana, Malawi, Mozambique, South Sudan, Tanzania are mentioned as priority countries. So again, focus on Africa, which is very welcome. I don't think they're limited to Africa. I just think they're prioritizing that. And I think to the points made by SMEs, I don't think that saying, a lot of the emissions are in food, therefore bring more funding to food systems is going to be enough. I think what's really missing is the specific guidance for SMEs so that if there's a protocol, much like you would have an SBTI, raw as that is, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on this SBTI flag. But right now, in terms of concrete guidance that a company can sign on to and confidently say, I'm doing something about climate change, there is no such guidance for SMEs today. I don't know of any. And this is across the board. It's not just SMEs in the food sector. So you might want to work through partners like SME Climate Hub or other collectives of SMEs that are working on delivering the actual procedure, the guidance. How do you sign on to a process that will signal to a policymaker or to an investor that you are doing something about climate? That is missing. And it might not be the only thing that is hindering progress, but certainly without that, it'll be very difficult to prove that you're doing something about this problem. Assuming you're looking at the climate problem, I think the other part of the narrative that you can strengthen very significantly is the adaptation narrative and resilience narrative, which is often across the climate space. We tend to talk less about adaptation and resilience, even though this COP tried to elevate that. But certainly where it all comes together for me is with SMEs, because much of the good stuff that food SMEs do speaks just as much to adaptation and resilience than it does to climate. So I would really try to double down on that. And I think we're optimistic about what the next COP is going to do. The signals have been positive, as positive as I've ever heard from any presidency of a COP. Then, of course, we'll have to see what happens with that. But they're already holding workshops on this and doing some pretty refined technical work to try and, as they say themselves, to put food on the same level as energy at the next COP28. So if they live up to that standard, then that's a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Federico. Feels like you've, in a way, taken us to the finish line, kind of wrapped things up and lifted us the heads up to look forward a bit. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fiona, Julia, Marilique. Really appreciate the work of Climate Eat and the Food Systems Pavilion of Climate Champions and Race to Zero and UNFCCC and the Climate Resilient Food Systems Alliance. Got there in the end. Yeah, really great for you bringing this in, and thanks to the entrepreneurs that turned up. Please, you're out in the world in these spaces. Please do keep looking for ways we can remember the role or the potential of the food SMEs to be driving change and bringing those voices in and advocating for them. I think it is a big piece of the puzzle if we can unlock that role. So keep an eye out for it. We'd love to help out as we can. Yeah. Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to close it out. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.